Hey everybody, my name's Zach, and today I'm going to talk about how to run the Call of Cthulhu 7th edition scenario, The Haunting. The Haunting is the quintessential introductory scenario for the Call of Cthulhu game system. It was written by Sandy Peterson, and it's been around as long as the game has itself. In it, the players are tasked with investigating a supposedly haunted house in 1920s Boston, and it's a really great introduction for both new keepers and new players because it's simple and engaging. So at first, I was going to do a typical walkthrough on how to run this scenario, but when I was getting my thoughts together, I realized something. I really have nothing to add here. Because of how long this scenario has been around and how beloved it is, there's myriad resources on the internet already that do a great job of breaking down the scenario and giving you tips on how to run it. So instead, I'm going to do something a little bit different in this video. I've mentioned in the past that I'm not that into the 1920s as a setting for Call of Cthulhu, and for this reason, the first time that I ran this module, I decided to reskin it for a setting that I thought would be a little bit more fun and evocative for myself and my players. So in my reimagining, the game is set in Seattle, Washington in 2010, and the players play ghost hunters who have heard on the internet about a purportedly haunted house on a small island in the northern part of Puget Sound. In the process of reskinning The Haunting, I learned a ton about how Call of Cthulhu scenarios work, and I think it's a great exercise for keepers to take a pre-established module and make it their own. So in this video, I'm going to take you through the process of how I took the classic Call of Cthulhu scenario, The Haunting, and reskinned it for the modern era. So let's get started. One quick disclaimer first, it should be pretty obvious from what I've said already, but this video is for keepers only. Call of Cthulhu is a mystery game, and if you spoil all the reveals for yourself in advance, you're not going to have any fun. Alright keepers, now that it's just us, let's dive in. So before we jump into the changes that I made, let's first quickly go over the bones of the story. If you haven't read the module yet, you might want to do that now, or at the very least you might want to go watch some overview videos since I'm not about to stop and explain every NPC, handout, and location. The mystery in this scenario is that Walter Corbett's body is hidden in a secret area of the basement of the house, and he isn't dead at all. He's undergoing a long process to transform himself into something inhuman. His presence and control over the mythos magic is the source of the haunting in the house. The players uncover this mystery by moving through these three main sections of the scenario. Firstly, the job itself, where the player characters meet Mr. Knott, the new landlord of the Corbett house, and he gives the backstory of the house and gives the player characters a motivation to investigate. Secondly is the backstory investigation, where the players draw on public information and private resources to learn everything they can about the history of the house, including the history of Corbett and the Chapel of Contemplation. And then third and finally is the house itself, where the players explore the house and encounter the horror of the mythos as Corbett tries to drive them out or murder them for intruding and discovering his secret. So with all that said, here's what makes The Haunting such a great scenario. I just gave a full picture of the entire story beginning to end, but I didn't have to mention anything specific about the setting or the monster. The bones of the scenario are solid regardless of the set dressing. Learning the history of a haunted house and then going to explore it is a great universal premise that is infinitely adaptable. So if I love The Haunting so much, why wasn't I happy with 1920s Boston as a setting? So let's start with the time period. I'm just not that into the 1920s as a horror setting. To me, it feels a little bit too caricatured in our popular imagination to be a convincing setting for horror. For horror to be effective, the players have to be able to imagine that the situation could happen to them. And for most people in 2021, it's a little bit hard to put yourself in the shoes of a Tommy gun-toting gangster. Sure, Lovecraft's works are set in the 1920s and that's when he wrote, but because for him, the 1920s were the modern era. You know, when you look at stuff like Antarctic expeditions, Egyptology, and the like, all that stuff feels like quaint anachronisms to us today, but at the time, this was the cutting edge of science for Lovecraft. So with all that said, I do recognize that for some players, the nostalgia factor is a big part of why they actually enjoy playing Call of Cthulhu, and I'm not about to stomp on that. So I picked 2010 instead of the present day, just so that my players could feel a little bit of nostalgia for, you know, hipsters, plastic white MacBooks, that type of stuff, but also could envision themselves present in the situation. Plus, playing in the modern day also makes it a little bit easier for the players to understand what's available to them. For example, most people don't really know what a Hall of Records is, right? So they wouldn't really know to look there for Corbett's will. But in the modern day, obviously, they're going to know that there's all types of stuff online. Some stuff is behind paywalls, some type of stuff isn't. So maybe a player would have an idea to, for example, get a JSTOR subscription and then look there for the will. So if my problem with The Haunting as written was just the time period, well, why not switch it to present day, but keep the Boston setting? Well, for me, I felt like the location of the Corbett house detracted a little bit from the horror. You see, the module describes the street that it's on as right downtown in Boston with modern buildings surrounding it, and the Corbett house is the only remaining 19th century structure on the block. And I feel like that takes away from the horror a little bit. Anybody who goes into the Corbett house and gets scared just has to run back to the front door and run out onto the street, and they have all the major resources of a modern city at their fingertips.
See? Everything's all right.
So to deal with these issues, I decided to set my game in the Pacific Northwest. Here's the title card that I used for the virtual tabletop that I created. I think Washington State is a great horror setting. No, not because of Sasquatch. It's because even to this day, many parts of the state are remote and wild still, and that's because places like the Olympic Peninsula were actually some of the last to be explored by Western settlers in the continental US. I also think the visuals for this area are very evocative for a horror setting. The forests are misty and full of moss and old growth trees, and the constant drizzle and the short daylight hours in the wintertime are a great set dressing for a horror story. I also live here, so I might be biased. So in my reskin, the players start in Seattle, which is a major city much like Boston, but they know that to actually visit the house, they need to take an hour-long ferry ride out into Puget Sound to a small island. I did this because a mainstay of Lovecraftian horror is characters venturing from the light and the comfort of the modern world into dark chaos of the primeval, where mythos lurks just out of sight from humanity. When the PCs get off the ferry at Orcas Island, their cell signal is not that great, right? And they're at the mercy of the ferry, which can also be held up by weather or mechanical issues. Once they commit to going to the island, they're stuck there. And it's kind of just like the bus in The Shadow over Innsmouth. In addition to just being plain unsettling, this also gives the players a bit more motivation to confront the horror of the mythos. In the Boston setting, if the players get scared, they can just run out the door and try to forget that this ever happened. But in my PNW setting, they're stuck on the island, at least until the first ferry the next morning, if it comes. So now that I've told you about my 2010 PNW setting, let's walk through the three main sections of the module and talk about how I adapted them to fit. First is the exposition with Mr. Knott, the landlord. There's a common opinion in the community about this section that I definitely share. Mr. Knott really falls flat. A job or a favor for a friend certainly works as a character motivation to explore the mystery, but it just feels weak. The NPC is forgettable, and it puts the onus on the players to come up with character backstories for why they're willing to persevere in the investigation once it becomes frightening. In my reskin of The Haunting, I just cut this section entirely. Instead, I handle motivation during character creation. I ask all my players to create characters who are modern ghost hunters. I give my players a bunch of examples: cheesy Discovery Channel shows, early ghost hunter YouTube channels, podcasters, self-published novelists, you name it. I pitch this scenario by telling the players that they're going to be playing ghost hunters who like to spend time on forums on the deep web talking about the paranormal and scouting for locations to make content about. They all become online friends over the years on the forums, and recently they've all come across a place that no one has done a piece on yet. A supposedly haunted house on an island in Puget Sound named the Corbett House. I start the game with them meeting in person in a cafe in Seattle for the first time, to do some research together on their laptops before they head out to the island. Here's what the virtual tabletop screen that I created for this scene looks like. I picked a real cafe in Seattle with a creepy name as the location. So I think this exposition works a lot better than the scene with Mr. Knott. Yes, I am restricting character creation a little bit, but there's so many directions that you can go with this premise. Are you a Discovery Channel star or an amateur YouTuber? Were you drawn into the field because of a strange, unexplained experience that you had as a child? Or are you just a charlatan who's out for the easy money? Are you a professional or are you a hobbyist? I also really like it because it ties everyone's characters to the spooky right from the beginning. So by the time they finish making their characters, their expectations are set appropriately, and they're all juiced up for a good ghost story. It also works really well to provide a narrative explanation for why the PCs would be working together without putting pressure on the group to come up with a shared backstory. And in that first scene when they're all role-playing for the first time and it's really awkward, well, hey, it's in character because meeting people from the internet in a cafe for the first time is a super awkward experience. Lastly, I think the character motivation from this premise is a lot more compelling. Each character has proactively chosen to conduct this investigation for their own personal reasons. It isn't just for some random job for a friend. Being ghost hunters gives them an excuse to push on in the face of all the creepy stuff they uncover as the investigation deepens. Now let's move on to how I reskin the primary investigation section of the module. Since I cut the investigation into two parts, information gathering in Seattle and then poking around Orcas Island itself where the house is, I had to decide which handouts should be available where. I broke it down like this: stuff you could find on the internet and stuff you couldn't find on the internet. All the published articles about Corbett and the house fall into my stuff that you could find on the internet category. They're published in the public domain. Each library use roll would cost the players half-day worth of internet research, and I didn't really prepare in advance whether they'd be found in the initial coffee shop laptop research or in some other location. More creative players may get restless just going to the cafe for multiple days, and so I just pretend that the location matters, but give the same handouts no matter what. I also included the civil court records with Reverend Michael Thomas's name on them in this section. I say that they need to be requested or searched on a paid platform like JSTOR, however. Finally, I made a few allusions to cultists following the PCs while they were still in the city. I put a creepy hipster in the coffee shop that watches them and hacks into one of their laptops. The hipster has a tattoo of the symbol that the players may later see on the Chapel of Contemplation wall. So that's the Seattle section. All the other handouts fall into the stuff you can't find on the internet category. This includes the secret police records about the chapel raid, the unpublished article, and of course the Chapel of Contemplations itself. All that stuff I put on the island: the police station, the newspaper office, the neighbor character Mr. Dooley, and of course the chapel ruins and the house itself. Since the clues in this section are location dependent, here's my virtual tabletop screen that points out the locations to the players so they know where to go to look for clues. Mr. Dooley is another NPC that gets a lot of hate in this module, but in my reskin, he's one of my favorites to play. Instead of a cranky candy stand proprietor, I run him as a local retired fisherman who enjoys telling tall tales to anyone who will listen. Last but not least is the Chapel of Contemplation itself. I situate these in an old forest road deep in the interior of the island. It doesn't show up on Google Maps or any web search results, but the players can find out about the location by charming a local in town. Last, but certainly not least, is the Corbett House itself. The good news is that this section requires the least amount of effort to reskin, because whether it's 1920 or 2010, a creepy house is a creepy house. Similar to the Chapel of Contemplation, I set the house deep into the interior of the island. The players have to drive a tricky dirt road to get there, and I like to play up the relatively derelict nature of the building and the creepiness of the forest surrounding it. Once inside the house, I pretty much run everything as written. One of the ways that the modern setting affords me to spook the players while they're inside is the existence of modern ghost hunting equipment, which can make some really creepy sounds. My favorite sound effect to pull out is the spirit box, which is a device that a lot of modern ghost hunters apparently use to supposedly hear the voices of the dead. It flips quickly through a huge spectrum of radio frequencies, and supposedly ghost hunters can hear the voices of spirits between the radio stations. It makes a really creepy sound. Listen to this. When it comes to ending this scenario, I usually like to finish the haunting with a TPK if the players try to run, so I'll have the still active cult from the Chapel of Contemplation creep out of the woods with daggers in their hands when the players try to book it down the dirt road back to town after getting scared out of the house. Players who do manage to evade the cult end up having to make a survival check once they run off into the woods, and when they fail, I'll usually have them fall off a seaside cliff or die of hypothermia in the woods, desperately trying to get signal on their phone. I like to leave the door open for further play with the group by ending the game with the player dying with just one check mark next to that text, and just as they breathe their last breath, the second check mark appears. So there you go. That's how I reskin the haunting for a modern setting. Feel free to steal all of my ideas here. Take the ones that you like, throw away the ones that you don't, and rework it as you see fit. Or better yet, take this kind of approach and apply it to a scenario that you're passionate about. It's a great way to broaden your understanding of the game and improve as a keeper. So I hope this video was helpful. I'm doing my best to put out regular RPG content on this channel, so be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss anything coming down the pipe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.